Free Speech Isn't Free by Scott Mason. Last week, after hearing the case of Citizens United versus the FEC, the Supreme Court struck down campaign finance restrictions against unions and corporations by a 5-4 ruling. Many politicians, commentators, and activists have been throwing a hissy fit ever since. The New York Times editorial board wrote a scathing editorial. Senator Arlen Specter, among other prominent lawmakers, have proposed a constitutional amendment to overturn the ruling. 60s icon Tom Hayden and Howard Zinn lent their names to a petition, and MSNBC's Keith Olbermann declared that the ruling may be even more dire than the Dred Scott decision, which, as you may recall, found that black men had no rights that the white man needed to respect. Perhaps there's some exaggeration going on, but do they all have a point? I mean, after all, shouldn't we limit the monetary influence special interests have on elections? On paper, it seems like a good idea, but in reality, it's anything but. For starters, this doesn't simply limit the Walmarts, McDonald's, and Starbucks of the world. It also limits nonprofit groups, unions, and citizen advocacy groups. What these are at their core are organized groups of people who pool together to have their collective voices heard on an issue. For example, the ACLU is a collection of people who are concerned about civil liberties issues. Limiting those collections of people's ability to express a political view is clearly a First Amendment violation. Says Glenn Greenwald of Salon.com, quote, "Laws which prohibit organized groups of people, which is what corporations are, from expressing political views goes right to the heart of free speech guarantees no matter how the First Amendment is understood. Does anyone doubt that the facts that gave rise to this case, namely the government's banning the release of a critical film about Hillary Clinton by Citizens United, is exactly what the First Amendment was designed to avoid? And does anyone doubt that the First Amendment bars the government from restricting the speech of organizations composed of like-minded citizens who band together in corporate form to work for a particular cause?" End quote. It's because of this that corporations have been granted the rights of legal personhood for many years. And so the ends justifies the means argument I keep hearing from critics of the ruling doesn't compute with me. Because if we can disregard the First Amendment if we don't like what somebody says or who it is that's doing the talking, then we might as well not have it at all. Further, the outrage many in the media have shown over this case has been hypocritical too, since, well, they all work for corporations. As Love Client Number 9, aka former New York Governor and Attorney General Eliot Spitzer explains, quote, "What distinguishes what Citizens United did and what Bill O'Reilly on Fox News and Rachel Maddow on MSNBC does every day? Fox and MSNBC are corporations bombarding the airwaves with political rhetoric from the right and left. That's as close to electioneering communications as anything I can imagine. The McCain Feingold statute excluded media companies from its limitations, a distinction that makes no logical sense. The constitutionality of Citizens United speech should have nothing to do with what else may or may not go on at the corporation it's a part of." End quote. Or, as well-known satirist and magician Penn Jillette puts it, quote, "Campaign finance reform has a huge upside for anyone in the media, whether it's the news or the arts. And it has a huge upside for incumbents who won't have to deal with people getting together and buying ads to say that the incumbents are wrong. They're working together to make sure that the revolution will not be televised. Now that campaign finance reformers, media, and incumbents all agree, what should you do if you want your voice to be heard? First, quit your job. Now start juggling, monkey boy." End quote. Jillette is, of course, making reference to the fact that he, as a magician and satirist, for his skills, can get on television to have time to speak about his views. But you, as a regular citizen, need the freedom to be able to band together and have your voice heard as part of a larger group. That's exactly what the Supreme Court ruling more or less says. Justice John Paul Stevens argues that money isn't speech. Of course, the problem is, in order to believe that, you have to believe that it's okay to restrict somebody's ability to spend money to advocate a position or criticize somebody. That sure sounds like a First Amendment violation to me. Then, of course, there's the issue that the campaign finance restrictions, while well-intended, do nothing in practice to stop corporate influence. Back to Salon's Glenn Greenwald, quote, "What is overlooked in virtually every discussion I've seen is how ineffective these campaign finance laws are. Large corporations employ teams of lawyers and lobbyists and easily circumvent these restrictions. Wealthy individuals and well-funded unincorporated organizations are unlimited in what they can spend. It's the smaller nonprofit advocacy groups whose political speech tends to be most burdened by these laws. Campaign finance laws are a bit like gun control statutes. Actual criminals continue to possess large stockpiles of weapons, but law-abiding citizens are disarmed." End quote. Greenwald is exactly right. According to the aforementioned New York Times, whose editorial board might actually want to read some of the articles in its paper sometime, Jeff Melio, an economist at the University of Missouri, has compared states with strict bans on corporate contributions to political parties against those with no limits at all. His conclusion, quote, "There's just no good evidence that campaign finance laws have any effect on actual corruption," end quote. To take it a step further, the 2008 presidential election involved more campaign money than any presidential election by far. In fact, Andy Stern, the head of the largest international workers union, the SEIU, has publicly bragged about spending $60 million to get Barack Obama elected. And that's just one group. You want to tell me again about how these reforms somehow got the money and corporate influence out of politics? Building on that theme, Reason Magazine's Matt Welch notes, quote, "President Barack Obama's weekly radio address over the weekend was an attack on the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in Citizens United versus the FEC. The second paragraph alone is worth the price of admission. Quote, "In my first year in office, we pushed back on that power by implementing historic reforms to get rid of the influence of those special interests. Obama's lobbying reforms, combined with an activist year of federal lawmaking, helped produce a record year for lobbying. The only way the phrase 'to get rid of' here is not a lie is if you read it as an aspirational intent and take the president at his word," end quote. In other words, as is usually the case, politicians love to talk about how they're going to do something or how they've cracked down on something, when in reality, they've done nothing of the sort. Look, I'm no fan of corporations having this kind of influence on our elections, but unfortunately, there's really no way to stop it. You can make any rules you want, but these corporations are going to get around them. As I mentioned previously, all these laws do is hurt ordinary citizens who want to band together and get their message out. Of course, there is one way that we could stop all this corporate influence in our government. It's not by passing some sort of campaign finance law or making all kinds of crazy restrictions. The answer is simple. Have a small, limited government that's constricted only to the duties that are allotted to it in the Constitution. If the corporations can't buy influence because the legislators are strictly limited to what they can and can't do, there's really no point to them funneling money into the system. And that's really why corporations spend so much money to try to influence our elections in the first place, because there's so much to influence. Cut back on what's available to influence, and you'll see corporate control diminish rapidly. But don't expect the politicians in Washington to take that idea seriously, because to a politician, their own power and their ability to create the perception that we couldn't get by without them is far more important than solving a problem.